By the end of the 1980s, David Cronenberg was the certified king of body horror. After over a decade-long run of innovative, gross-out horror films that included The Brood, Scanners, Videodrome and The Fly, it could appear that no other filmmaker would have come close when it comes to the subgenre. However, there were many other interesting directors through the 80s also making boundary-pushing body horrors in North America and a little further afield. In the US, filmmaker Stuart Gordon was making mind-melting Lovecraft adaptations like Reanimator and From Beyond, which were filled to the brim with grotesque images that shocked and upset the senses. But it was actually Stuart Gordon's producer, Brian Usner, who then had a go at making his own body horror film in 1989, which is now often crowned as one of the most grotesque films ever made. Meanwhile, over in Japan, an indie filmmaker, Shinya Tsukamoto, created a 67-minute low-budget experimental film with his mates that, to this day, remains one of the most viscerally powerful, shocking and influential body horrors ever made. Join me as we continue exploring the mind and body, and we discuss Brian Usner's Society and Shinya Tsukamoto's Tetsuo the Iron Man. Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our journey through the mind and body, and this is part 15, in which, as that intro suggested, we're going to be looking at two gross body horrors from 1989, Tetsuo the Iron Man and Society. These will both be spoilerific reviews. If you haven't seen them yet, go and give them a watch. I believe Society is on Amazon Prime. Tetsuo is available on BFI Player, but also I think you can watch it on YouTube. And it's only 67 minutes, so go and give it a watch before listening to our discussion. So later on in the episode, I will be joined by the BFI's Michael Blyth to discuss all things Society. But first of all, let's begin by chatting about one of the most bonkers films I've ever seen in my life, Tetsuo the Iron Man. Joining me to discuss this movie is one of the most bonkers people that I know in my life. He was last here with me discussing Angel Heart. He is a writer for the BFI Sight and Sound, Little White Lies, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Welcome back to the podcast, Lou Thomas. Hello.
Hi, Mike. How you doing?
I am very good. How are you?
Oh, I'm loving life as per.
As per. So let me ask you, body horror. Let me start by asking you a bit about this weird and wonderful little niche subgenre called body horror. What do you think of it? What are your thoughts on it?
It's terrific, Mike.
Yeah.
It's you got to love it. I mean, part of all of us why we get into horror generally is because we've often got, aside from a need. And a need to be scared.
Yeah.
Perhaps a lot of us have also got a need for something that's a bit gruesome, that's a bit grisly. You know, heads getting cut off at the very least, people getting chainsawed, etc.
Yeah.
And then body horror is often, explicit, isn't it? It's often like, oh, look at that, that's been cut and that's been hurt, and oh, look, there's some psychological trauma mixing with the actual physical trauma.
Yeah,
body horror
and
is
usually
just
something sexual as well. There's always like sexual, especially when you look at Cronenberg or even the film we're about to talk about. There's definitely a kind of sexual element to it as well.
When you're, this is for the learned scholars, not like myself, to get into. But when you look at what body horror is, a lot of the time it is stuff being inserted into bodies, right? So you could say, even the act of like a knife or something going into a body is like an act of penetration.
Yeah.
So you can see why the sort of sexual side of it gets talked about and gets interrelated as well.
Are you at all squeamish with anything like body horror related?
Like so many things in life, Mike, I both embrace and reject it at the same time. So I'll go. If a friend of ours will say something like, oh, there's this really gruesome film, and it's got this appalling, disgusting acts in it with this horrible, you know, like you say, stuff getting pulled out of people, stuff getting inserted into people.
Yeah.
I'm at once like, oh, that's horrible. How can anyone watch it? But at the same time, I'm like, yeah, put it on now.
Yeah, I've got to see it. Exactly.
Yeah,
we have that morbid curiosity, I think, don't we?
Of course,
we absolutely do.
Yeah.
Are you somebody that's ever been interested in, you know, body art yourself? You're not a man with piercings, tattoos, anything like that?
This is the thing. I've not got any tattoos or piercings, or I'm not into any of that stuff myself.
Yeah.
But I've got you know, as we all have in 2020, we've all got plenty of pals, or at least a few pals who are bang into it, and that's totally cool. It ain't my thing, but it's a bit like, I don't know, long hair. It's like I haven't got it myself, but I appreciate it on others. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
You can put any sort of nonsense on screen and I'll lap it up like a dog. But like, put a needle near me and that's about as much as I can take it to have a vaccine. Get vaccines when you need them, people. You know, political.
I love it. So, with all that in mind, let's talk about one of the strangest films I think I've ever seen in my life, Tetsuo the Iron Man.
Well, first of all, I know that anyone listening to this podcast is not going to be about like, oh my God, I can't watch that. That's going to be too gross.
Yeah.
But if you're recommending it to any of your pals who aren't super into the stuff we're into, you've got to give them some warning.
Oh, yeah.
It is completely depraved. It's obviously extremely violent. It's obviously extremely violent and extremely gruesome, but a lot of it is a very particular type of sexual violence.
Yeah.
It is like quite horrific, and quite strange and and repulsive to many people, and completely depraved. Nearly every scene, you can't really watch more than between probably a minute and 5 minutes of any part of the film without being, oh my God, that's disgusting.
Yes. It's such a dense film, isn't it? That's what I always think. It's so packed with incredible images. It feels like not a second is wasted. You know, it's they almost, like you say, almost every single shot is in some way something violent or grotesque or interesting or kinetic or mad, and it's crammed into a really short running time, right? I mean, it's only about 65 minutes.
Right. Yeah. So this is the thing. It is short, and there are two sort of pretty obvious reasons for this. Number one, well, the short run time, you've not got to shoot as much, you can do it cheaper. Yeah. So we know that, and we'll get onto the budget and the cost of the film and all that sort of business a little bit later. But the thing with it is, it's 67 minutes, so it was obviously done fast and cheap. But there's not a lot of plot to it. I will give us a quick run through of the plot, but there's not a great deal of it. In fact, I'll give us a run through right now.
Oh, go for it.
So first of all, the director Shinya Tsukamoto.
Yep.
I hope I've got that right.
I think you nailed it. Yeah.
Excellent. He is the director, and he's also in it. He plays this very strange bloke who's a metal fetishist. Yes. And the film basically begins with this guy, Tsukamoto.
Yeah.
He is staggering around what looks like a kind of scrapyard / workshop kind of environment in a sort of industrial bit of Tokyo. Mm-hmm. He's sort of staggering around, and he goes into one of the sort of huts, rooms, whatever. Is he living there? It's hard to, it's like, is it a work live space, whatever the hell it is? Even that is quite opaque, which is quite interesting, you know. He goes into the shed, and he literally gets a huge kind of bolt and then starts inserting it into himself.
Yes.
Right, into his leg, in fact. Digs it into his leg. And it's quite graphic. And you're watching that thinking, okay, this is a crazy way to start a film, but fair enough, you're going with that. And then pretty quickly, all these maggots start congealing around the wound, right? Yeah. And that's just the beginning of the film. And that's the most normal bit of the film.
That's about the first 3 minutes, isn't
exactly.
It?
He then, as you probably would, goes completely crazy, runs into the road, and he gets run over. He gets run over by what appears to be a businessman of sort of generic businessman, who is played by a guy called Tomoro Taguchi, and who's been driving along with his girlfriend, who's played by Kei Fujiwara. Now, so that is pretty much it in terms of the people in the film, and from that point when he gets run over, the guy who in the credits is only referred to as salary man, which is I suppose is the equivalent of just businessman.
Yeah.
Right. Then, literally from that moment, it gets bonkers because it's not really told. It's sort of semi-linear in that, there are flashbacks, and the way a lot of it's told is via like the salary man seeing bits of it through a TV screen. The way it's hard to describe this film because until you've seen it, you'll be like, what the hell? Then the kind of next bit is the salary man is on the phone to his girlfriend. He's on the phone to her, and then he sort of starts to see a bit of metal poking out of his face.
Yeah,
very much, actually, very reminiscent of Jeff Goldblum in The Fly. Very quickly, the salary man starts becoming half a metal person. Basically, and then basically it's the rest of the film is him having kind of flashbacks and visions of the guy he ran over and his girlfriend and him becoming this half metal, half human, but then 90% metal and so on. Anyway, so that's the basic plot.
Yeah.
That's pretty much all that happens.
You did a very good job there of talking about the plot.
To be honest, it's quite a difficult one, isn't it?
It's a very difficult one.
I've seen it twice. I mean, you could see it 10 times and you probably wouldn't be able to get much further than that. You can embellish a couple of little details and say more, and the ending is completely crackers. It's almost like the beginning. Well, no, I won't say too much, but it's almost like they want to start to take over the world with some sort of metal person cult. But even then, you're never totally understing what the hell it is, whether it's a vision or whether it's a dream.
You don't know you don't know what's a dream, you don't know what's a flashback, and you don't know whether it's being told in a linear fashion or not. So nothing really fits together, does it? Because of course, like you said, the fetishist is killed in the opening scene of the film. He is run over, but he stays in the film throughout the rest of the thing, and kind of it's almost like I was thinking you could, if you put it in a basic term, it's almost a revenge tale. It's like this metal fetishist is killed by this salary man, and then the salary man is punished for this hit and run, right, by turning into an Iron Man.
Right. The fetishist says, right, well, I was into this, but now I'm going to curse you with this. Exactly. That's kind of the thing. But the plot aside, there is actually like tons and tons we'll through. There's certain. So one bit I particularly want to talk about is the when the sort of quite close to the beginning of the film. After the train station and sequence where he runs down to the toilet and so forth, he thinks he's being chased. The sort of the first real emergence of the metal and him becoming this Iron Man.
Yes.
The first real emergence of it is, well, I don't know how you'd really describe it, but it's like a giant metal drill cock.
Yes. I mean, that's exactly how you describe it.
Yeah, right? Okay, so that starts coming out of this guy, and he's like doesn't know what the hell to do, and the girlfriend is like, what the hell's going on? It's absolutely completely bonkers.
It is. It's so manic, isn't it? Like, I guess the first thing I want to ask you, the biggest thing I think that strikes you as soon as this film starts is the way it looks and the way it sounds, I suppose. Let's start with the way it looks. What are your thoughts on the cinematography? You know, this is set in Tokyo, but it kind of doesn't really look like Tokyo. It's black and white. It's 16mm. Did you kind of enjoy the way this film looks and feels?
Yeah, so I was bang into it for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
For a start, it is. I mean, I know the term cyberpunk means a lot of different things and different writers and whatever, but it kind of is that what we would call cyberpunk.
Yes.
It very, very loose terms in that it's fast, it's really fast, not just, the obvious 67 minutes, but the fact it's cut really quickly and the camera work is really agitated, isn't it? It's really agitating.
There's even those kind of sped up shots that like kind of whisks through the streets. Yeah.
And all the while there's this clanking, industrial, insane music, which I love, which reminds me of loads of good stuff. Like there's one particular bit where the beat sounds like something off a New Order,
right?
And there's like True Faith by New Order. There's a beat, if you know that beat to that song, but True Faith by New Order. There's quite a lot of the soundtrack that's got that sort of consistent sort of beat to it.
Actually, I was going to ask you because I mean, you were a music journalist too, right, Lou? And like I feel like. Don't you reckon this film must have influenced a lot of music videos in the 90s?
Oh, yeah. It's got that sort of vibe to it, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And it's like, it's industrial, it's relentless.
It is relentless.
It's relentless, but it goes very well with what's happening on screen because the action of this film it doesn't slow down very much. It's always like clanking, drilling, like I say, metal cocks coming out of people. And there is a insane scene where he's dreaming, and he dreams that the girlfriend is basically has this kind of strap on that's a long, curling, snake-like twisting cock.
Yes.
And he dreams that he's willingly, or at least semi-willingly, sodomized by her.
Yes.
And it is. You really need to see this scene to believe it. It is, and it is exactly what I say when I say that.
It is.
Yeah.
It's the look and sound of it. What's really clever about it, I think, is that the film feels like it's made of iron. You know, everything about it. The monochrome, black and white. There is almost something iron or metal in every single shot. It feels industrial, and then of course that constant soundtrack. Most of the music is in some way a kind of jarring metal noise, right? Metal as in the material, not metal as in the genre of music. Like it's iron. Everything in this whole film is made of iron. It feels mechanical. It feels industrial. In that regard, actually, it reminds me in the way it look and sounds a bit of David Lynch's Eraserhead.
Right. First thing I wanted to say was the name of the guy who did the soundtrack is Chu Ishikaya. Oh God, I'm terrible with I feel sorry for any Japanese listeners. It's not because I'm ignorant, I promise you. Okay, for me, it's got a lot in common with Eraserhead.
Yes,
in that it is gruesome, it is black and white. You're not quite sure how much of it is really happening and how much of it isn't. And
that kind of industrial noise as well that runs through Eraserhead.
Yeah, completely. You can see there's a lot going on where there's sort of similarities. Although having said that, the bits where they relive the crash, the music totally changes. The music changes to this like sort of cheesy, sort of funky saxophone music. It's this like literally like Chaz and Dave.
Yeah.
And I don't know if any of your listeners have ever heard Chaz and Dave, but you want it, they're like a Cockney rock and roll band, right? The music totally changes to this like.
It does.
It cracks me up. Yeah, when I was watching it last night, I was like, oh mate.
It's almost like a kind of 80s soap or something. It becomes all of a sudden. Yeah, very weird. But anyway, aside from that bonkers music, the rest of it, like we said, is so mechanical. It is reminiscent of Eraserhead, isn't it? I'm sure it must have been directly influenced by Eraserhead.
It's interesting that is one similarity, but the other thing it does remind me a little bit is things like RoboCop.
Yeah.
You know, where you've got you've got that the RoboCop and The Fly. I mean, I know the guy's not a cop, but it's the fusion of metal and human, isn't it? That's the thing. I mean, the soundtrack is obviously great. The way it's shot is really interesting, and cyber and punky and whatever. But for me, it really, what I love about it is that it stands up as a kind of a great example for filmmakers who are like, oh, we haven't got much money. What can we do? You know,
I know.
Because there was only 3 or 4 people. You know, the director played the part.
Yeah.
They shot it in the girlfriend's real life flat. There was very minimal crew. It's if you look at it, although it is quite almost revolutionary in terms of how crazy and demented and exciting and fast it is, it's clearly quite lo-fi, a lot of practical effects. There's a bit of stop motion in there.
There's a lot of stop motion.
Yeah, you know,
so good.
There's no obviously it's pre-CGI, so
Yeah.
there's nothing like that. Although having said that, if we look at it 89, I suppose if we really want to go no CGI, you know, James Cameron was using stuff for The Abyss by that sort of point.
Yeah, it's true.
So, you know, but the difference is James Cameron was making films for $100 million or whatever, and these people were not.
No,
really.
no.
But like it's a great example of filmmakers who go, well, we haven't got a lot of money, what can we do? Well, anyone getting into film, anyone thinking, oh, I've made a short, I want to make a feature, but I'm a bit not sure, what do I do? The ideas in this film alone, I mean, look at it. We've discussed, and there's not really that much of a plot. There's not really that much in terms of characters, but yeah, it's totally thrilling.
Yeah, it is.
You watch it. You're not going to watch it and go, that's boring, are you?
No, it is anything but, isn't it? It's this kind of overwhelming in how kind of extreme and loud it is, you know, throughout. Yeah, I love it. I've seen it maybe 3 times now. Still don't completely understand really what I'm watching, but I do watch it almost like I'm watching a music video. That's what it feels like to me. Like you just kind of let it wash over you, I suppose. And actually, you know, we're going to be talking about quite a few Japanese and actually just, I guess, Asian horror films, because we're going to be talking about even things like Park Chan-wook's Oldboy later on in this series. And that, I do think there's a tradition of you know, kind of like gruey body violence in a lot of those sorts of films. Takashi Miike films like Audition and Ichi the Killer and stuff as well.
Obviously, as we said, we could have a whole entire podcast series about Asian cinema and where it goes, and even a substrain of, say, criminal and violence and horror.
Yeah,
the different bits of it. But you mentioned Audition. Which is
wince-inducing.
I still wince. You say it and I wince. You know, you say it. Yeah. But no, Old Boy, of course. There's some good hammer action in that. That's pretty good.
Incredible. Yeah.
But no, there's a lot of great sort of extreme Asian cinema out there. That's you know.
Pretty gnarly.
Exactly.
What did you think of the gore itself then, and the practical effects and the way this is pulled off? I mean, we talked about this film was tiny budget, made for next to nothing by this guy and his couple of mates in his girlfriend's flat, but almost every single shot is some sort of incredible special effect, whether it's something being penetrated into the skin, or blood gushing from a wound, or worms crawling out of a wound, or sort of stop motion transformations. Obviously this guy himself starts turning into this robotic like iron, you know, hybrid. There is a hell of a lot. It's actually a very, very ambitious film, isn't it, for a film with low budget? How do you think it looks? Do you think that the practical effects still hold up?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
Like, for one thing, you look at it, it looks old.
Yeah.
It does. It looks old. But then again, I'd almost put it like, well, you look at Terminator.
Yeah.
And that looks old by today's standards. And it looks like, oh, you can see where it's back projection and you can see where it's models or whatever. But because, again, this is probably the only real connection that it has with Terminator, is that because it's so all-encompassing, because it's such an experience watching Tetsuo, you're swept away in it, because there's not one glaring bit where it's like, oh, that looks really bad. It all kind of looks slightly cheap and it looks slightly old, but it all sort of, it's seamless in the way it looks. Yeah,
it's almost like because it's so otherworldly, it almost feels ageless to me, because it's so over stylized, you know. Because yes, of course, some of the effects you can tell they were made in the 80s, maybe, with stop motion and that kind of thing. But also, the whole fucking film is so weird that it kind of fits in a way, because there's a kind of jarring clunkiness about it that fits whatever this sort of clunky story is, you know.
You couldn't have a polished film that looks like that. You couldn't. And even when you try and think of there aren't really. You can't have an insane, delirious, polished film, because even the whether it's horror or whatever films that are insane and delirious, they need to have a kind of a messy feel to them. I mean, something like Mandy is complete chaos on screen, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that, I'm sure if you sort of looked at it a bit closely, you'd go, oh, that's a bit dodgy, or that didn't quite work, or whatever. But with a film that has such a distinct feel and look, you sometimes you've got no choice but to go with it, right?
Yeah, definitely. Just immerse yourself in it. Do you think this film is saying anything in any way? You know, a lot of people might speculate that this is kind of anti-technology film. It's kind of almost a Black Mirror-esque kind of cautionary tale of the way man is merging with machine, maybe, or reliance on technology, you know, or sex become, you know, some people have even speculated that it might be a response to the AIDS epidemic. I don't know. Did you have any thoughts on that at all, about what this film could really be about?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it could well be. I think the AIDS response is probably about the best, because it's clearly not the work of when you watch it, it's clearly not the work of an idiot, right? And you couldn't in the 80s, you couldn't avoid it. You couldn't avoid it. That was the big, you know. Unfortunately, as we speak, as we record this, we're living through a global health disaster.
Yeah.
And again, we're living through a global health disaster, which it's in its infancy, so we don't really know that much about it. And look how scared the world is now.
Yeah.
You know, so you can see that the art that was being made in the late 80s. You know, they would have known. They would have known about AIDS by this point. They would have known that you got these horror stories, and it's a lot of it isn't it? Penetration in this film.
Yeah.
It's penetration. It's the dangers of penetration.
Yeah.
It's the dangers of even this guy with a metal cock and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, you're right.
And he's getting, and then she's getting sodomized. It's like there's too much in it for me. There's too much happening for it to be about nothing.
Yes.
I mean, of course, fundamentally they've made a film to entertain and to make people go, "Wow, that's bonkers." Yes, of course, but yeah, it is maybe saying be careful of what you do with your body. Maybe do play it safe. Maybe that is the message to it.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's definitely something there. And like some of the best Cronenberg films, there's an element of disease or infection about this too. The fact that this guy, this salary man, has come in contact with this fetishist and then has like almost caught something from him, and his girlfriend too, right? It's like this almost infectious disease that has spread amongst our three characters or something.
Right, very topical.
Yeah, exactly. Well, how many horror films are we going to see over the next year or two that are in some way a response to the global pandemic? I mean, we've already had Host this summer, and I feel like that's just the first. That's the tip of the iceberg, isn't it?
Well, funny you mentioned Host, because how can you not? Again, for anyone listening, especially if you're listening to this, in sort of autumn 2020 or the end of summer, whenever. If you're listening to this, Host for me, I'm sure we've all seen it by now, but it is very much. It's probably not my favourite film of 2020. It's not even my favourite horror film of 2020, because at the moment that's either The Invisible Man or Possessor.
Yeah,
but again, we can come on to that another time.
Yeah.
But like, Host is. For me, it must be the film of the year. Whether it's the best or not is irrelevant. It's because of what it is. It's made in lockdown. It's made on the cheap. It's made very smartly. It's made of like people being scared, people being alone. You know what I mean? It is the film of the pandemic.
Yeah, it is.
You know?
It's the film of 2020, isn't it? Yeah, and actually it reminds me of what you just said about Iron Man, about how, you know, you could show this to film students in a way of like, look, even if you have no money, if you've got a good idea there, you can make a film. Even if you just use Zoom, you can make a film now, you know, that is effective, you know?
If you are a young filmmaker, or even an old filmmaker, you should watch Tetsuo and you should watch Host.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you're so right. And do you find, I mean, speaking of Host, actually, you know, a film that was genuinely frightening, I think. Do you find Tetsuo the Iron Man frightening in the kind of classic, traditional sort of horror way?
No, it's not scary. It's very often very darkly funny.
Yeah, it is funny, isn't it? And it's grotesque.
Oh yeah, it's grotesque, and it's like there are definitely going to be people who'll be like, I can't watch that.
Yeah, oh, totally.
You know, I can't watch that. There will be loads of people who couldn't watch it, but it's not scary, but it's definitely horror.
Oh my god! And I find it really, you know, I do find that really interesting. Like you said, you know, there's a lot of horror fans out there, or people that listen to this podcast, you said, will probably be fine with this film. But actually, even within the horror community, there are a lot of people that cannot take body horror, that I've spoken to that are like, oh, I love horror, I love haunted house films, I love ghost things like that. I can't take body horror, and it's really interesting that is for a lot of people where they draw the line, and I do think actually this film would really gross out even horror fans, because it's disturbing. And I think, like you said at the beginning when you introduced the film, that there's a sexual element to it as well that is really disturbing. The giant drill penis is quite a disturbing image, and then also the strange kind of dream sequence. It's quite funny but also quite creepy, where the girlfriend has that giant, again, sort of metal strap on that, like you say, she sodomizes her boyfriend with it. Is it for his pleasure or is it against his will? That's kind of ambiguous. But I think there is something in body horror, and especially when it's linked with genitalia and sex, that does freak us out, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. We as fundamental as it is, we've all got a body, haven't we? Everybody, without fail, not everybody has broken bones or anything like that. Not everybody has, I don't know, slipped and landed on a knife. But pretty much everybody has cut themselves or hurt themselves or accidentally done something idiot like a paper cut or whatever. We've all hurt ourselves and gone, my body, or we've accidentally, or someone's done it to us by accident or unfortunately in some cases deliberately. Human bodies do get hurt. If you use them, they get hurt. That's it, right? So body horror, it's instantly relatable, isn't it?
It is. There's something me and Jamie Graham just talked about with Hellraiser. The odds are, especially with recording this in a global pandemic, the odds are that you're not, when you die, it's not going to be via chainsaw killer. It's going to be a disease or a virus, right? I mean, that's the thing. It's like, in some ways, that should be the thing that we are the most scared of in films, because that's the thing that's probably going to get us, which is quite a bleak point. But
it is. In the end, though. There are other diseases and stuff, like whether it's cancer or whatever, and it's interesting. I'm sure I read some chat that actually in 50 years, by 2050, there might actually be cancer, might be not like cure, you don't take a pill and it's gone, but like pretty much all cancers might be they might be able to treat them so people can live with it. Yeah, exactly, which is crazy when you think about it, isn't it? The advances of medical science, and I've no doubt that when we're long gone, there'll be people who'll be like, reading in history books about the pandemic, and people will be going, what? Why were they bothered about that? It was nothing,
Yeah, well, that in itself is interesting, and I think that in itself is what people like Cronenberg and what films like Tetsuo are exploring, right? That kind of man-conquering biology almost with machinery. Like we're coming up now with enough technology to beat viruses, to beat diseases, and to make ourselves almost invincible, right? People could get metal joints or whatever it might be, and I guess all of that is playing into Tetsuo as well.
Yeah,
in a way.
Totally. Well, it's sort of semi-related. You're talking about you can replace body parts and stuff with metal. There was a thing in it was actually The Guardian. I hate it when people talk about Reddit in The Guardian, but I did actually read this on The Guardian's website. I feel bad for even saying it, but
you're such an arty-farty lefty media.
I feel so bad about it, because when anyone ever talks about anything, but no, I read it in The Guardian, all right, don't hate me, but it was the first article they published that had been created from artificial intelligence.
Oh, wow.
Right, and it was edited by a human, but they basically, a scientist or a scientist student of some kind at Berkeley in California, he they'd fed this AI I think 5 or 6 sentences to kick the piece off, and said, right, there you go, create it. And they created 8 sort of essays, and then The Guardian edited. And then they said we could have published any of the 8 essays, they were good enough. But they just cut and pasted, they sort of cut some of the essays together. And it reads as like more or less as good as you would, and even better than some of the stuff, a lot of the stuff they print or publish.
Yeah.
So you just think, whoa, this sort of time, it's been a long time coming. When you see old films, you look at stuff and go, well, there are no flying cars now. Well, there aren't. But I tell you what, we got phones that can do everything, and that follow every single thing we do. So a lot of the stuff that wasn't predicted has come to pass, and some scary stuff is on its way.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. So finally then, let me ask you just about the ending. I mean, you mentioned that strange ending where it seems like it's almost, we're hurtling towards this dystopian world where iron is going to take over, or everyone is going to become merged with machinery or metal in some way. Do you kind of have any read or any thoughts on that ending? Did you like it as an ending to the film?
With the ending, it feels like the start of a superhero film, or a supervillain film.
Yeah.
And I love it when, we've all seen enough superhero origins films now, and there's going to be many, many more of them, so you can avoid them or not. And it would be interesting to see if they do take over the world with this cult of metal machine people. And I love it when you see a film, when I say a normal film, a film that isn't in the Marvel, DC, Universe or whatever, that isn't a comic book adaptation. When you just see an in quotes normal film and then it turns into something that might be a superhero, or it might be a supervillain or something like that. Now, a great example of that would be M. Night Shyamalan's Unbreakable, right? Which is a great ending because it ends on this.
Which is a horror film until it becomes a superhero film.
Right.
Amazing.
So I love that. That's a good example of it. There is actually a film, a really good kind of indie film that's been knocking around this year and last year on the festival scene, called Fanny Lie Delivered, which has got a kind of it sort of ends on this note of wow, is that the origins of this character? And it's got a really good ending,
and it's kind of a folk horror too.
That's a great film. But there are, so what I'm getting at is there are films outside of the typical comic book, Batman's, Superman, Spider-Man. There are films that end on this note of wow, what's going to happen next? Is this going to be? And that's what's great about the ending for me. It's like, they're this cult, and are they going to? And like in your head, you're sort of left with it. Oh, are they going to take over the world? Maybe they do. Maybe that this parallel universe is this world of metal machines.
That's so interesting that you said it's like a supervillain or hero origin story. I didn't think of that at all, but it's so interesting because we've actually talked about that already this series. We spoke about that with The Fly. And, of course, you've already mentioned this film has similarities to The Fly. I'm not sure if maybe it was influenced by The Fly or with Cronenberg, but we talked about, when we talked about The Fly, how that almost could be a superhero or supervillain origin story. And it's definitely there, isn't it? It's that idea of a person messing with something they shouldn't be, and then their body changing because of it. That is how so many comic book characters kind of begin. I think, me personally, I always saw this ending as more of a sort of Black Mirror-esque ending, this kind of dystopia, this apocalyptic vision of machines are going to take over, that this is just stage one and it's going to get worse and worse and worse. And of course there are 2 sequels to this film, aren't there? I still shamefully have not seen the 2 sequels. Have you seen them?
I've only seen the first sequel, and that isn't what happens. There isn't a cult of lunatics. I know, but it is still very good. It's not quite, it's a little bit more polished than the first one, but it's still worth seeing. Unfortunately, I've not seen A Snake in June, which is the director's. Apparently it's as mental as Tetsuo, so everybody should go and check that out.
I love it. So there you go. So finally then, would you still recommend Tetsuo? Like we said, it's a cheap film, it's maybe a little bit dated now. Would you still recommend it to genre fans out there?
Oh yeah, for me, I mean, just a caveat, a bit like we did at the start, I wouldn't recommend it to anyone who didn't have a reasonably strong stomach, right? Because it is, when you've got maggots crawling over someone's metal wound in their leg,
or somebody being anally penetrated by a big metal spike or whatever it is.
Yeah, you've got spikes and metal dildos and whatever else. It's quite extreme. Like I say, I mean, I don't give a monkeys. I watch anything on screen because that's who I am. I don't, what is on screen is not what's happening out there in the street, is it? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But there you go. I'd recommend it with caution. So I'd recommend it to any horror fans who are like, I think I can take this. I'm with it. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it to my mum.
Yeah,
she wouldn't watch it. She wouldn't watch something that's like like a 12 rating, you know what I mean?
Well, even my girlfriend Rihanna, who is a film critic, was in the other room, and she could just hear the soundtrack, and she was like, "This sounds fucking awful. What are you watching?" And I was like, "Yeah, it's probably not up your street."
That did crease me up. Yes, when Rihanna said, "Oh, I don't even like horror," I was like, "No, mate, how can you go out with Mike then?"
I know. I know. We have the polar opposite film taste, but there you go. I love it. And actually, another thing that because you've written a really interesting piece about it for the BFI, right? And it's available online for people to. I'm giving you a little plug there.
This is really good because I was sort of going to say earlier, do I plug it? Do I not plug it?
Oh yeah.
For anyone listening, right? If you want to read, there's a million things you can read on it if you dig around. But if you want to read a short, sharp, why is this film so great kind of thing. I'm not going to read out the full URL because that's ridiculous, right? But if all you have to do, literally, is type Tetsuo and then Lou Thomas, and literally that is what comes up. You Google that, and straight away my piece comes up, and you'll be like, "Wow,
it's like the name of the next sequel, Tetsuo and Lou Thomas."
I mean, mate, can you imagine me smashing it about? Can you imagine me smashing it about with a metal bloke jumping on a bus, jumping on a 185, going to Peckham or something? Yeah.
Oh my god. Yeah. But actually, yeah. Like I was going to say something that you mentioned, which I agree with as well, is that actually, weirdly, despite what we just said about how extreme it is, it's also kind of accessible. For example, like for people that are maybe put off by subtitles or are put off by arty films or whatever, it's something you can easily watch, right?
Right. Yes, this is a point. Actually, I made this point in the piece I wrote.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm quoting Lou Thomas, Iron Man.
So actually, that is one of the really truly great things in this. There's very little dialogue. It is pretty much there are a handful of lines of dialogue in the film, and it's because it's short and because it doesn't, you can kind of read into it what you want and so forth, and because it is extremely entertaining, it is actually on that level very accessible. If you could see it, you could put it on in the background of you could put it on in some sort of art installation. You could put it on for anyone who's sort of like, oh, that sounds quite interesting. I think it's got this weird dichotomy to it because it is, like I say, savage and depraved and disgusting and demented. But it's also accessible. What a weird film.
It is. Yeah, you're so right. Felt like watching a sort of hour-long Aphex Twin video. That's what I felt like I was watching.
Yeah. when you consider, exactly. When you consider, you stick an hour of something on Netflix and it's an hour of a TV show, and you're like, it might entertain you a bit. But the fact that this is in and out 67, in and out in all sorts of ways when you see the film, when it's in and out in 67 minutes, and it's like, oh yeah, very little dialogue, lots of clanking noise. Yeah, I mean the only thing, the big caveat is, for Christ's sakes, if you're gonna go out and get drunk or whatever, go and have a big party, the next day don't try and watch it with a hangover, it'll kill you.
Oh my god, it would absolutely kill you. Yeah, it really would. Even watching it when I was a bit tired, I was like, I had to turn the volume down because it's so jarring and overwhelming, isn't it? The soundtrack, it's full on. So there you go, Lou. Thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for joining me.
Anytime, mate. A pleasure as always.
Absolutely bonkers film. If people want to find your work, your writing, and find you out there on the internet, where can they find you?
Oh, well, just walk out down the bus stop. I'll be scrawling on a bus stop going, down with school. No. I mean, just do the usual stuff, man. It's like Lou Thomas, Google me, and I'm on the BFI's website, and a little bit on Sight and Sound and Little White Lies and NME, and I get around, as they say.
I love it. Lou, thank you very much.
Cheers.
A big thank you to the amazing Lou Thomas there. What a film. Tetsuo the Iron Man. I mean, I can't wait to hear what you guys all made of that film because for me, it's absolutely mind-blowing. So let's move on to another mind-blowing, bonkers, grotesque body horror from the same year. Joining me to discuss all things society, one of my very favourite, most regular guests on the podcast. He was here only a few weeks ago discussing Carrie, but I had to get him back for this film because he's such a big fan. Welcome back to the podcast, Michael Blyth.
Hello, it's good to be here with you again.
I know, well, it's so lovely to have you here. Now, you, of course, are a programmer for the BFI and also for London Film Festival. And actually, London Film Festival 2020, it's coming up, right? Are you kind of in the midst of LFF organisation hell at the moment?
Yeah, we are. We've announced the programme, so that's out there, and now it's just the kind of, run towards the festival starting itself. Yes. So, yeah, exciting times.
Very cool. Now, Now, we won't talk about it for too long, but I'd love to just hear quickly, for anyone out there who, especially people, I suppose this time it's a chance for people who maybe aren't London-based to still get to actually get access to some of these films. And you obviously program a lot of the kind of cult stuff that goes on during the festival. Are there any sort of big recommendations or films that people should check out who listen to this podcast?
Yeah, well, normally the cult strand, which is the kind of genre strand in the festival, is bigger than it is this year. We've got a vastly reduced LFF program this year, so actually it's a small but perfectly formed selection of 3 films this year, all of which, of course, are wonderful. So in the cult strand this year, we've got Possessor, which is the new Brandon Cronenberg film.
So good.
Very fitting for your mind and body series. Brandon, son of David, of course, very much kind of continuing the body horror themes of his father, but doing it in his own very distinctive ways. Really extraordinary.
It's great, isn't it?
Out there piece of filmmaking. Really loved it.
I loved it as well. He's really interesting. Like you say, he's kind of following in his dad's footsteps, but doing something a bit new and interesting, isn't he? As well at the same time.
And it's quite nice because obviously his dad's not making those kind of films now. He hasn't made those for ages. So it's really good that someone is.
Yeah, we've still got a Cronenberg doing this stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's great. There's a film called Relic, which screened in Sundance earlier this year. It premiered in Sundance, where it got really rave reviews. Really extraordinary. I guess you'd kind of describe it as a haunted house film, but it's not a haunted house film. It kind of starts off that you think it's going to be that, and then it's very much not that. Very interesting kind of allegorical horror film, but quite often when you think about horror movies as allegory, you think of them being quite subtle. But this is kind of goes all out. It really goes full on into kind of horror territory in the last kind of 30 or so minutes. It's really so. Is
really
it like
amazing. In my head that kind of it feels a bit like it's going to be something like The Babadook or something like that? Is it that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think so. I think for me, it's. I mean, I'd probably
say
this,
you don't like The Babadook.
I don't not like it, but I don't love it as much as everyone else does. It's kind of slightly lost on me that.
Fair enough.
The reverence with which people hold it. Relic it's very interesting. I think it goes into ideas around kind of dementia and care that are really interesting and turns that into a really extraordinary horror movie.
Amazing.
And the other film that we have is called Rose, A Love Story, which is a debut British film.
Great.
A kind of pseudo vampire type movie about a couple isolated in the kind of woods somewhere who are kind of shielding, protecting, I guess, the outside world from the disease which one of them suffers from. For fans of films like Martin or The Transfiguration or Let the Right One In, those kind of slightly alternative vampire films.
Yes.
This is very much up that street and is a really remarkable piece of filmmaking.
Amazing. I'm very excited to see that. That sounds really good. So people can just find details of how to check out these films on BFI website, I take it, right?
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, because this year, in light of what's going on, we're kind of largely online this year, so people can access them across the UK. So it's a really exciting opportunity to kind of reach audiences outside of London in a much bigger way than we ever have had the chance to do before. So yeah, check out the website. There's details of how you can book the films and you can watch them at home.
Very cool. So last time you were on the podcast, we did talk briefly about body horror, and I asked you a bit about your thoughts on Cronenberg and that kind of thing. Obviously, Cronenberg isn't the only person that sort of dealt with body horror in the 80s. There were a couple of other big names that I often think of, like Stuart Gordon, right, who obviously made movies like Reanimator and From Beyond in his career. And then, of course, Brian Usner, who was his producer, he began directing his own films, which, of course, we're going to talk about. But first of all, just give us a little bit of background info about these two filmmakers, about Stuart Gordon and Brian Usner, and what kind of films they made.
Yeah, sure. So he had a very close working relationship with Stuart Gordon. So Stuart Gordon obviously made, as you say, Reanimator, From Beyond, Dolls, all of which Brian Usner produced.
Yes.
And I think they kind of, got together with this mutual love of horror movies, and particularly love of H.P. Lovecraft as well. You can see the influence of Lovecraft in the films that they collaborated on, not just in terms of straight adaptations, but the influence looms very large in the work. And Usner co-wrote From Beyond with Stuart Gordon. The two of them also together wrote Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, which is one of those things that people often kind of forget, that they had this little slight foray into kind of Disney kids movies.
Kind of kids body horror, right?
Yeah.
I mean...
I guess so. It's kind of interesting. I think there's I don't know a huge amount about the kind of details about that, but I kind of have read a few times that maybe they were slightly kind of edged out of the project. I'm not sure exactly what happened there, but how amazing would it have been if their career could have taken a very different turn had Stuart Gordon, who I think was actually originally lined up to direct Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, but anyway. But the two of them had kind of worked closely together, and then Eusner had wanted to move into filmmaking himself and directing himself, and had kind of looked at a few different projects and been working on a project which I think was called The Man, which was a kind of sci-fi horror movie about kind of all men being aliens, basically, and that didn't work out. And he had a spec script from a couple of young writers, spec scripts called Society, kind of piqued his interest, and he was kind of drawn to that, and ended up making that, and talk a little bit more in a minute about the evolution of that and how it kind of changed from the original script and kind of what he brought to it. But I mean, for me, I think Eusner is one of the kind of great unsung horror filmmakers. He's a real favourite of mine. I think he's really extraordinary, and I think he's a filmmaker that was kind of suffered a fair few misfortunes along the way. I think you can kind of see like a trajectory of his career in which he kind of kept not really getting a chance and not having a chance to really shine in the way that I think he should have done. And, when you think about Society, and it's, for me, Society is one of the kind of extraordinary horror movies of the 80s, one of the great horror debuts. Yeah. But people don't talk about it in the same way that people talk about Sam Raimi's Evil Dead or Clive Barker's Hellraiser. Then it's not this kind of start of this extraordinary career. And I think people don't think of Society as a kind of Brian Eusner film. They just think of it as this kind of odd curio that exists. And it's like, well, gross out. Have you seen Society? That ending is so fucked up.
Exactly.
But I think, people don't necessarily often engage with kind of him and his filmmaking. And there's Society has a kind of interesting backstory and when it got released. And I think it kind of had a kind of staggered... it didn't kind of get off to the best of starts, really. Right. So it was filmed in like 1989, and I think it got a UK and European release around that time, but it wasn't released in the States until like 1992.
That's interesting.
By which case it was disappeared, it was buried. The Americans didn't really kind of get it. So what should have been this kind of great calling card and this great kind of arrival of this new cinematic talent really just kind of got dismissed and got forgotten about. And then subsequently the next few films that he made were sequels to horror movies. He made Bride of Reanimator, which I really love. I think it's super fun, very really much good. In the spirit of the first Reanimator. I don't think it's as great as the first one, but I love the kind of universal horror references and the kind of the bride and all this stuff. He also made Silent Night, Deadly Night 4.
I've not seen that.
It's good. It's better than you might think it's going to. It's the kind of Halloween 3 of the Silent Night, Deadly Night franchise, in that there's no Killer Santa in it.
Right.
It's much more a kind of almost like Rosemary's Baby-esque kind of paranoid exploitationer. It's pretty good. I think it's it's much better than you would ever think Silent Night, Deadly Night 4 would be. And he also made Return of the Living Dead 3.
Yes.
Which
people love.
I love that film. It's so great. And I think what was kind of interesting about the kind of sequels, particularly Silent Night and Return of the Living Dead 3, is that they sit outside of those franchises. Return of the Living Dead 3 was not a continuation of what had come before. It's almost like a standalone story, a kind of zombie Romeo and Juliet.
They are their own things, these films.
Exactly. And it's kind of like, actually, he was making these next part in these franchises, but doing something completely different, doing something completely his own, really turning them around and really kind of lifting them out of a kind of direction in which they were going. But, they're like the third and fourth part of, low budget horror movies. Like, who cares about those other than us? Like, who's going to give him the attention? Who's going to kind of look at those and be like, oh, wow, I think we're seeing something quite special here.
That's the problem, isn't it?
So you see this kind of path in which he was kind of, arguably kind of forced upon, because he wasn't necessarily given the opportunities, the budgets, the scripts that he might have, been able to really take and run with. So you get, around the same time in, I think, 1993, he made Necronomicon, or contributed to Necronomicon again, which I love. In, I think, 96, The Dentist, which I really love, super fun film. And from there on, it was a real decline into kind of, like straight to DVD kind of horrors, but in the worst possible way. Rottweiler, and I think Amphibian 3D or something. These real kind of low rent stuff. And he kind of showed in the kind of later stuff little of the kind of spark and ingenuity and excitement that he showed in those early films. But I think that there is something there. You watch these early films of his and there's such a voice there, there's such a point of view, and there's such a kind of Eusner-ness that he brings to those films, that you can talk about him next to Cronenberg, you can talk about him next to Clive Barker, and these people with a really specific vision. I always think it's just a tragedy that he's not held in that same regard.
It's so sad, isn't it? I wonder if people we'll talk about society, obviously, but I wonder if people were just too shocked and grossed out by it or something, or like you say, it kind of gained that reputation as something that maybe it isn't. I don't know.
Yeah, I think when you have something like that as well, that's, you know, the ending is so overwhelming.
Yeah.
So it almost feels like a gimmick, that film.
Right.
And I think it's only when you revisit the film you realise it's actually not a gimmick.
Yeah.
You know, it's a really complete piece of work. It's a super interesting film all the way through.
For Bill Whitney,
I've never been paranoid.
fear plays a large part in family life.
I feel like something's gonna happen. And if I scratch the surface, there'll be something terrible underneath.
He's afraid his sister
Could you zip me up, Billy?
is not what she seems.
God, Bill, what's the matter with you?
He thinks his friends are out to get him.
Make waves, Whitney. You're gonna drown.
People are what they are. Now you have to learn to accept that.
He's about to find out the truth.
Why are you guys doing this to me, huh?
What, you've been living with these people all your life and you didn't know anything about this?
Is far worse than he could ever imagine.
If you don't follow the rules, Billy, bad things happen.
Didn't you know, Billy boy? The rich have always sucked off low-class scum like you.
Uh-oh, Billy.
Clarissa? Don't be so intense. Now, some people make the rules and some people follow the rules. It's a question of what you're born to.
You never were one of us.
You know, you really deserve what's going to happen to you. I don't think so. Wait.
Can't you see they're setting you up for something?
You know how I hate to give you drugs.
You're officially dead.
Don't go home, Billy.
No.
Bill Whitney is about to become one
Showtime, Billy!
with society.
Who are you? Let me give you a hand, Bill.
In Beverly Hills, what you fear is only the beginning.
Anything for society.
So society is, I mean, obviously you always said at the beginning, like, spoilerific detail, but it's like, honestly, people, if you haven't seen Society, do not listen to this. Go and watch it now. Come back in like 98 minutes. Because you really do not want Society spoiled for you. But so basically, Society is about a teenager called Bill Whitney, who is from a kind of affluent socialite family in Beverly Hills, but always feels kind of disconnected from them and displaced, and like he doesn't really belong there. His kind of paranoias escalate over the course of the film, particularly when he starts to kind of get wind of the fact that perhaps these kind of socialite events that his family attend are a little bit darker than what he might imagine. You know, his sister's kind of coming out party is actually some kind of potential incestuous orgy. You know, it's his kind of increasing kind of paranoid journey throughout the film to uncover the truth, which all culminates in the film's extraordinary closing sequence in which he finally realised exactly what society means.
I love it so much. What's your own personal history with this? Do you remember sort of how you first discovered it?
Yeah, I mean, I get, you know, it's one of those that I'd kind of heard about. I'd heard this idea of, well, society's like super crazy, and saw it. And I remember when I was really young, I really liked it. I mean, I was really grossed out by it when I was a kid. I think also it was that kind of, you know, because it's such a combination of kind of the grotesque and sex, and I think you know, as a child I was kind of drawn to it and fascinated by it, but kind of scared by it and repulsed by it and all these things. But you know, I still have that now as an adult, FYI. But now except you're just kind of a little bit turned on as well, you know? Exactly. I was like very confused about my feelings here, but yeah, sorry, carry on. But no, so I really loved it, and I think, like I said, over the years my relationship with it has, you know, it's really kind of stuck with me. It's a film that I revisit quite often, and it's a film that becomes, like I said, more and more complete almost every time I watch it. It feels like more of a, you know, it exists for me far beyond the final 20 minutes now. Absolutely. And I think, you know, when I was younger, it was all about getting to that kind of final sequence. Yeah, totally. And now, you know, I'm I'm just as enthralled with the first 100 minutes, or
yes,
first 60 minutes or whatever.
Exactly, I agree. I had the same thing. I remember I used to collect, Empire magazine and Total Film every month, and there was one issue of Total Film that I loved and I read over and over again. They had this whole big middle section on the 25 grossest movie moments of all time, and I was so obsessed with just looking at the pictures of them and then seeking them all out. And it had stuff like Pink Flamingos on there and all that kind of stuff. But the number one was Society, and they had this massive double page picture spread of the final sequence of Society, and I was just like, what is this? So I think that's it, isn't it? Its reputation kind of precedes it these days for everyone in that kind of way. You seek it out. So before we get to all that stuff, tell me a little bit about, you mentioned that this maybe, Brian Usner kind of in some way might have made some changes to the original story or original script and kind of made it his own a bit more. What did he do exactly to this film then?
Yeah, so from what I understand, the original script was... the kind of end was essentially that it was more of a kind of cult thing, and it was more like a kind of blood sacrifice type thing that happened at the end. And I think that from what I've read about Usner talking about the film is, he was really drawn to the plot, this kind of paranoid aspect, this idea of the outsider, this idea of a kind of, evil blood-sucking society and this kind of elite kind of group of monsters that exist, but didn't really feel like the ending had that pop or had that kind of wow factor. So he kind of worked towards this different ending, the ending that we see now. And I think that very much came to fruition when he collaborated with Screaming Mad George, who did the special effects for the film. And, the two of them just kind of ran with this, and it became, it moved from a kind of more conventional kind of culty, blood sacrifice type thing to this kind of body melding, body horror, extreme thing that you see at the end of the film.
What do you think of him then? Like we mentioned, this was his kind of debut. He had worked a lot with Stuart Gordon previously. Do you see the kind of seeds there of the Stuart Gordon work in Brian Usner's directorial debut here, would you say?
I mean, I think they both display a kind of rough and readiness that I enjoy.
Yes.
There's... I think that both of them aren't necessarily top of their concerns, isn't kind of script performance and logic to a certain extent sometimes. I think they're about ideas, they're about moods and themes and
visuals too. I do think the visuals pop in both their work,
absolutely.
Right?
I mean, with Stuart Gordon, it's kind of recently been, after he died and was kind of revisiting all the films and having a kind of my own mini Stuart Gordon season. I mean, From Beyond is just such an extraordinarily beautiful film.
So beautiful.
The lighting and the kind of colour scheme in that film is like nothing else.
Yeah.
So
it's my favourite of his, actually. I love it. Yeah.
So when I say rough and ready, that's no means dismissive. But I think there is a kind of a slight kind of trashiness to their films that they really lean into. I think that's kind of part of it, and I think that trashiness really works particularly well with Society because we're in this kind of like pastel-y, brightly coloured Beverly Hills, kind of upper class milieu, and there's almost like a daytime soap opera vibe to it.
Yeah.
It's like when you watch Society and you think about it, it's like for most of that film, it feels like, a kind of soap opera stroke Beverly Hills 90210 with a bit of Heathers thrown in there.
Yeah.
It feels in a kind of teen mystery kind of wrapped up, kind of nods to like David Lynch every now and then and things like that. But it very much kind of works as this kind of glossy, soapy teen exercise. And, the kind of makes the kind of final descent into what happens even more shocking. But I think, he very much kind of embraces that side to it. There's something about the performance style, there's something about the kind of script that feels perfunctory. And it feels like, which ultimately everyone's doing, is people are just kind of performing and reading their lines and kind of going along with this kind of script to, for a kind of means to an end, I guess. Yeah,
you're so right. Is that there is that strange, like you say, it's quite Lynchian, that sort of fake veneer of this kind of happy Americana sort of 100%. Thing, right?
I mean, there's
like sort of sordid depravity going on behind closed doors.
Exactly. It's the kind of Blue Velvet thing. It's like all over society. And, Brian Usner's not subtle in his metaphors. He's very literal in what he is. Like right from the beginning, he's being like, this is what this film is about. In the kind of second sequence when Bill goes to the psychiatrist and he bites into the apple and looks into it, and it's kind of maggot infested rotten apple, and it's this very, very clear message about this kind of surface veneer and what lies underneath. Cut to a few minutes later, and it's like the parents out in the garden by the kind of rose beds, and they're looking at the slugs that are in there. So it's like the kind of horrors and the kind of grossness behind the beauty. And he runs with that all the way through. So it's another thing I really love about Society, and I love about Usner is that unsubtlety. And it's like, this is the point I'm making, and I'm going to like hammer this home to you.
I 100% agree. And it's really interesting because there is that sort of Cronenbergian body horror, but I guess Cronenberg is always still sort of thought of, even though his films were really grotesque, as being very smart as well, right? And having something more academic or whatever you want to call it to say. Do you think that this film has more going on than what might appear, on the surface, would you say? Is there more stuff going on there than the rotten apples and that kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think you're right, in terms of the way that people think about Cronenberg. I think like the way that the body horror functions in Cronenberg versus Usner is very different. Like Cronenberg's very rooted in kind of science. And there's almost this thing where he's putting something on top of it that feels like this could kind of happen. There's some kind of twisted logic here that you could kind of understand this. And also I think to a certain extent, Cronenberg's films are a weird mix of kind of sexual but completely asexual at the same time. When you think about something like Rabid and the way he uses Marilyn Burns? Marilyn Chambers. I forgot.
Marilyn Burns is Texas Chainsaw.
Okay, the way he kind of used her in that film, and she's kind of sexualized, but also at the same time, it's a weirdly asexual film. It's a very clinical film.
I find that as well with a lot of his early work.
And the same kind of later on when you move into something like Crash or something, there's a clinical, kind of surgical aspect to that, which isn't... His films are really like titillating.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas Society, I think, is much more kind of bodily in the sense of like it's much more tactile. And it's much
very
more,
wet.
Yeah, it's very wet. Exactly. If Cronenberg's like cold metal.
Yes. Exactly. He's something
used
warmer
as like
and wetter.
A fleshy mound.
So true.
So there's difference, but I mean, there's similarities there in the way that they use kind of sex in the body and stuff. But I think it's definitely. Cronenberg's more drawn and interested to the kind of science behind it, and Usner's more into a kind of human or a kind of melodramatic human response to things.
Yeah.
But of course, underneath the kind of body horror, very much the film is there's the kind of political undercurrents of the film, which are again not held back. They're literally spoken in the last weeks of the film, and it is about the upper classes and about the kind of rich elite feeding off the poor. And it's an analogy that runs throughout the film and then comes to a very literal head at the end of the film where there's this literal kind of orgiastic, grotesque feeding
the
shunt
life
sequence. Where they're kind of feeding on each other. So it's very much a product of the late 80s with this kind of post-Reagan era, thinking about the excess of the 80s, this kind of idea of like greed is good, Wall Street, Gordon Gekko, these kind of, and it's a response to that, and it's a very critical response to that. It's a film that feels just as timely now. You can't watch Society and not think of Donald Trump. It feels it never loses its power to be, to kind of speak of the time we're living in. I think that's something that's really extraordinary about it. There's a lot going on there, but I think again because it's not like a underlying message that academics can pore over and be like, oh, I found the secret of society and I can impress you with my brilliance. It's like, oh no, this is very literal. Like you've hammered this home so much. So I think in some ways it's like, again, it's another reason why the film might not be as talked about or held about in such high regard. There's not something to uncover or work out in Society. It's kind of out there. And I think another kind of thing, partly of why it was more successful in the UK and Europe than it was in America, is the stuff that it does talk about around class and class systems is maybe didn't speak to Americans in the same way. I think I was reading an interview with Usner when I was kind of before doing this and kind of thinking about some things that he said, and he was talking about this kind of British and European idea of the class system is very clear. Like, people really kind of understand it and they really kind of live by it to a certain extent. But there's this idea in the US that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's funny.
That it's like everyone is just this kind of middle class, and there's kind of shades of it, but there's not this kind of distinct class system. And you think about kind of Trump and this idea of like wealth that you're kind of born into, and this idea that he's speaking for the people, making America great again. But he's like the evil. He's like the product of what's that grotesque capitalist society. So there's a lot in there that's to kind of get your teeth into, but it's not left for you to work out. It's just presented to you in a really, really matter-of-fact way.
I wonder if it's also, do you reckon it was in any way sort of the unlucky in its timing too? Because like you mentioned, it came out in 1989, but then also a couple of years later, early 90s in America. And we've talked about this before, about how that's that weird period of horror history, right? The sort of late 80s, early 90s, when it was almost like people, for whatever reason, didn't seem as interested in that kind of gruey horror anymore as much as they cared more about the kind of prestigious Silence of the Lambs type movies or whatever. I wonder if it also, had it been released 10 years earlier, maybe, would it have made more of an impression?
Yeah, exactly. Or 10 years later, I think you're right.
Yes.
I think there was that kind of like no man's land period of like very late 80s, early 90s when horror just wasn't really held in very high regard. And it kind of shifted. We talked about similar things when we were talking about In the Mouth of Madness.
That's it, yeah.
And it was like it just fell at this difficult time, and actually it was doing so many interesting things with the genre. And you kind of look back and you think, wow, this was like a really pivotal, really important film in discussing the genre and kind of how the evolution of it and things, but it just kind of got lost. And I think that losing that film was just kind of devastating, I guess, to Eusner's career. Like he could never quite recover from that. Like it should have been the start. Like it should have been the thing that launched him into this kind of stratospheric, Romero, Craven, totally, Eusner. Like I wish we were talking about him like that, but we're not. I know, it's so true. And I wonder, had it been released just a few years earlier, like 1984, 85, whether it would have been different in some ways. It's really strange.
What's going on here, guys?
Oh, it was nothing, Dad.
It's okay, Daddy.
I thought we weren't going to be seeing David Blanchard anymore.
Yes, Daddy.
You should be getting ready. Judge Carter will be there tonight.
I'm almost ready now.
Oh, Bill, wasn't that Milo outside?
Yeah, he was just going to take me to...
So you mentioned, that there is a kind of soap opera feel to this, and actually for the bulk of it, is it even a horror film? It kind of feels like a sort of teen comedy through a lot of it, doesn't it? And I guess just on that kind of surface level, how much do you enjoy the first hour of that film just as a teen movie and kind of, this main character and kind of being in this world? How do you sort of find that and the way those characters are written and performed? Yeah, I love it. I love it more now than ever. Yeah. Watching it again now, I love the more kind of non-horror stuff. Yeah. There's so much humour in the film. Yeah. I think I mentioned before Heathers, but I think there's such parallels between Society and Heathers that you can make. There's something so knowing about this kind of artificial environment that he creates that is, like I said, it's very kind of references, even the casting of Billy Warlock in the main role, who was like a kind of soap actor, and around the time of Society or just after was on kind of Baywatch, and that was what he was kind of known for. He's this kind of teeny idol, but very much in this kind of daytime soap world. He's not a kind of respected actor. I think he does a really good job in Society. I think he's a really engaging kind of lead guy, but it's not a great performance. But there's something about his performance style and the kind of performance that Eusner wants to get out of him that works so perfectly with the film. I think, we were saying before, it's something about performance in the film that exists throughout once you get to the end of the film, and then he's got these doubts all through that he doesn't fit in with his family. Like, I don't even look like them, I exist slightly outside of this kind of circle of people. Literally, he's like a short guy, he's like this small little guy, and everyone's kind of towering over him. He's this kind of like dark haired next to his kind of blonde, beautiful, they all look so Aryan next to him. He's this kind of slightly kind of outsider, and part of Billy Warlock's kind of physical presence kind of lends itself to that. When you get to the end of the film and then you realise that
they're not his family. You know, this was basically like many, many years in the making. Where they were kind of grooming him to be this sacrifice, to be this, you know, thing they were going to feed off at the shunt.
Yes.
And you realise that actually the whole time, like, everything's been a performance. Like, everything his family's been doing, everything, you know, the people around him in this town have been doing is a performance. So having this kind of like soapy, trashy vibe to it is kind of perfect. So it's actually a film that you can kind of mock and kind of laugh at and scoff at all the way through. And at the end, it's like, got you. You know, I knew what I was doing.
Yeah, that was the point. Exactly. Yeah, you're so right. That's true. It's just think as well, like, they've been doing this his whole life. Like, what was his upbringing like? What was life for this boy like when he was like 5? Like, was he actually raised properly by these parents and stuff?
Yeah,
it's so
when you get to the end, it's like they're like, you know, you're kind of born into society, you know, not like you from, I don't know, wherever. They don't even tell you where he's from. And, you know, there's so much about society that doesn't really make sense. It's like, wow, like that was like a lot of hard work, a lot of years put in for
it's a big plan.
Could you not just kidnapped him 10 minutes before? But, you know, I think, again, it's not about that. I think it's a film about kind of big concepts and big ideas. The you know, ins and outs don't matter so much. And it's very easy to let them go and kind of forgive it. And I think Usna throws in lots of stuff along the way that doesn't go anywhere, that's just very enjoyable. Like, you know, the kind of main thing that I always think of is the character of like Clarissa's mum. Who's like, she's kind of wandered in from another film, and it's really kind of surreal moment. You know, for some reason she's really drawn to eating hair. She's this kind of silent, strange, heavily made up presence that
really weird
kind of floats in and out of.
That is because that has nothing to do with anything, right?
No, nothing really.
You kind of think she's going to turn out to be some sort of monster or some sort of brain dead like minion or something. It's really weird. Do you know what it reminded me a little bit of tonally as well, which I guess is around this era, is Peter Jackson. That moment when she throws up the hairball almost reminds me of something you'd see in Brain Dead a couple of years later or something like that absolutely. As well. It's that sort of tonal similarity.
Home a little early tonight, don't you think so, Mother? Has that brain of yours finally gone completely numb?
Mrs. Carlin, Bill Whitney.
And yeah, I think that is interesting, that idea of this boy kind of not feeling like he belongs. Because there is that, like we've talked about, obviously there's a lot of class elements going on to this, but also it is a really interesting teenage adolescent story too, right? About this boy kind of struggling with his own identity and all sorts of stuff. And I know that, you know, a lot of people consider this a great queer horror film as well. In what way would you describe this as a queer horror film?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm very much on the kind of society queer.
Yeah.
You know, on the side of it being super queer, I think that, you know, part of why I guess I really related to it and why I was really drawn to it when I was a kid, there's something about this kind of figure of the outsider.
Yeah.
That speaks very much to kind of queer people. This idea of not fitting in with your family, not fitting in with your environment, feeling like something's wrong. I think, you know, the thing that's different with society that's interesting is, whereas in most kind of queer narratives, it's about you feeling like you're keeping a secret.
Yes.
Whereas in society, it's about everyone around you is keeping the secret. So
yes.
It's slightly different in the way it functions, but essentially this idea of not fitting in, feeling different, feeling outside, feeling disconnected from your family, and feeling kind of afraid as well, I think is a really powerful part of it, and something I think that kind of queer people can really relate to. But there's lots of stuff throughout the film. I'm not necessarily saying that, you know, I do or one should kind of read Bill's character as queer, but I think there are things that could indicate a kind of sexual confusion that he's going through.
Yeah.
You know, he's kind of drawn to various women throughout the film. There's his kind of girlfriend with which he kind of actually has a fairly asexual relationship.
Yes.
I think they kind of make out on the beach, but essentially they don't really seem to like each other.
Again, they kind of seem like a, on the surface, sort of almost performative homecoming queen and king sort of couple, right? Yeah.
He also seems kind of slightly drawn to his sister and has a kind of slight apparent sexual attraction towards his sister.
Yes.
And then there's Clarissa, the girl with which he becomes kind of really obsessed and stuff. And, you know, you have these moments with him looking at these women in different ways. You know, you see Bill kind of wandering into the bathroom while his sister's having a shower. Like, why would you do that? Yeah. And then, you know, like, you know, him looking down at Clarissa while he's giving that speech at school, and she's kind of Basic Instinct style, like opening her legs. So there's very much a thing of like him kind of watching these women, but it's often kind of coupled with him seeing them in kind of ways which are slightly kind of grotesque or kind of twisted versions of themselves. Like his sister is kind of twisted around in the shower.
Yes.
After him and Clarissa have sex, her body's kind of contorted in a way that's not anatomically possible.
Yeah.
And there's something there that kind of speaks this idea of being interested and drawn to and attracted to, but also kind of frightened of these female bodies, which I think is something which is never kind of fully explored throughout the film, but there's always just this hint of him being unsure as to what he's attracted to, or kind of questioning what he might be attracted to.
Yes.
And then, of course, like as the film goes on, and once you move into the kind of later scene and the kind of shunt sequence, it becomes very much more broadly about kind of anal penetration.
Yes.
I think it's very rare to see a fisting scene in any film. This has 2 fisting deaths in it, which I think is like, I think a record.
Deaths. Yeah, it's so good.
So there becomes this kind of fear about anal penetration, which exists very much through those kind of end scenes. And also what's kind of interesting is you have, in amongst this kind of cascade of horrors that exist within the final, 15 minutes of the film, I think one of the kind of moments which was most shocking to people is the moment where Bill and, is it Ferguson? Is that what he's called?
Yes.
The kind of like bully, horrible, kind of socially elite guy at his school.
Yeah.
They kiss and they share this quite long kiss together.
Yeah. I love that was the most shocking moment.
Yeah, and I think that was a kind of moment that did really like outrage people. Like all the rest, this this kind of fantastical horrors, like we can kind of get on board with. But like these 2 dudes kissing is kind of too much for us to handle. And it's funny because there's lots of kind of sex and horror, and there's lots of kind of, it's a very tactile film in lots of ways, but there's no kind of intimacy in society, and there's no kind of human connection. And I think that is actually one of the moments where there is this moment of intimacy, and there is this moment, I'm not saying they're both like getting off on it necessarily, maybe they are, I mean I certainly am, but there's something in it that does feel like an actual kind of human connection. It does feel like a legit just regular kiss that they're having until they pull apart and his mouth's distorted and that kind of thing. So there's something in that about this kind of moment, this almost slightly tender moment in amongst the horrors that again just feeds into this idea of a kind of queerness in the film. And more broadly in that final sequence, there is fundamentally a kind of breakdown of kind of gender and sexuality, and it just becomes a kind of free-for-all. And I think the term kind of sexual fluidity has never felt more appropriate, because there's this there's this idea of kind of sexual fluidity, like people are just people and we're just kind of getting on and we're everyone's exploring each other's bodies, but literally people are like merging into each other, like their bodies are flowing into each other. So I think there's something like super transgressive and kind of celebratory in that last sequence, which is obviously grotesque and it's obviously repulsive, and it's designed as this kind of metaphor of like the rich feeding off the poor, and it's it's supposed to be kind of horrific and kind of politicized in that sense, but there is something euphoric and celebratory in the way that these bodies are kind of coming together. And it's rare that you see films that are so, especially films that kind of focus on male characters, that are so kind of upfront in doing that so go that far into exploring this idea of kind of bodies connecting with each other, bisexuality, sexual fluidity, all these kind of things. It's they're really at the forefront. So I think there's lots of stuff throughout the film that kind of lends it a queerness, but I think fundamentally that idea of the outsider, that idea of the fear of not fitting in, is so rife throughout the film that for me it's impossible not to read it as queer.
Yeah, you're so right. And I think there is something almost weirdly, that end sequence is something quite celebratory almost in it, isn't it? Like we were just saying about Cronenberg. When you look at his earlier films, like you said already, there's a kind of coldness to them. Movies like Rabid or Scanners or even Videodrome, even though they are quite sexually explicit, like you say, it's not titillating in any way, right? Whereas this film, I mean, yes, it's gross, but also I was kind of like, is this a bit hot at times, this film, and it's it just feels like it's actually embracing it's embracing that sexuality more.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that probably the kind of most Cronenbergian comparison is the final sequence in Shivers, in the swimming pool, and there is that kind of like orgiastic moment, and it is actually, there is a moment of people connecting, and there is a moment of kind of euphoria that you feel. But society, it goes kind of further with it, and I think the thing that people never talk about in terms of society is kind of the beauty of that last sequence.
Yes.
Like, obviously it's gross, but it is kind of beautiful as well. There's something like this beautiful kind of tableau that you see. You know, it feels like, you know, you think about like Salvador Dali's The Great Masturbator, or you think of Hieronymus Bosch.
Yeah.
You know, there's something kind of painterly and ornate and extravagant and beautiful about it.
Oh, well. Look what we have here. You gonna rescue the young maiden, Billy?
Right, something like that. You and me, man to man.
Well, a slave revolt. I love it. You gotta save the girl that's so cute.
Billy, don't! You only make it worse!
Shut up, Clarissa. Jim! Nan! Where the hell are you?
So this is what I was going to ask you. I mean, obviously, it's widely considered, like I said, I read a list in Total Film that said this was the grossest ever moment in any film ever. Would you agree with that? Is it the grossest moment of all time?
No, I don't think it's the grossest moment. I think it's, for me, because it's so far related outside of the realms of reality.
Yes, it's so stylized
that it can never be like truly gross. I mean, it's gross. Like, don't get me wrong, but it's not gross in the way that it's. I don't know. It's not disturbing in that way. Like, for me, gross is, you know, like something that you could be like, this could happen. Like, this is like this is sad and depressing.
Yeah,
and
like,
upsetting.
but just before we started recording, we were talking about Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, right? Like, that is quite gross and disturbing in a kind of much more kind of nasty, grisly
exactly. I'd
way.
rather live in society than I'd live in Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer.
Yes, exactly.
You know, so I guess it's kind of gross on the surface, and I think it's gross if you take it. If you watch that film once, you're like, oh, that was gross. But I think you watch it again, I think the kind of beauty of it comes out with repeated viewings and the humour in it as well. Like, it's so funny. It's so like blackly comic all the way through. Yeah. You know, in that kind of final shunt sequence, it's like gag after gag in that. Like, you can watch that and just like openly laugh all the way through. Yeah. You know, his dad with the kind of butthead moment.
So
and,
good.
You know, the like the judge when he's like comes out and he's got the birthmark that he's kind of taken on from someone else, and you know, just before the judge is gonna basically like fist. What's the guy called? I can't remember what the guy is called.
The guy who disappears near the beginning. Yeah, I can't remember what his
when
name
he's gonna fist him to death.
Yeah,
and he's just like, let's get to the bottom of things, you know, and getting his like fingers ready.
It's so, and there's so much like looby kind of liquid at that point as well.
But it's funny. It's like broadly kind of comic in those moments as well. So, you know, it kind of functions on lots of levels, and gross is one of them, but it's by no means the only one.
No, because like we've said, it goes so far into, it's camp basically, isn't it? It's extremely camp. Yeah. How do you think it holds up just in terms of those practical effects? I mean, so much about 80s body horror is about those effects and those visuals, right? Do you think it still looks good?
It does. I mean, it looks amazing. I mean, it's like, you know, obviously you kind of, it doesn't look real necessarily,
no.
But it doesn't need to look real.
I think that's what saves it in a way, because like we talked about, it's like almost Dali-esque kind of surrealism, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's like, you know, there's something so, again, it's about artifice, and it's about kind of things being fake and all this kind of stuff that ties in so many ideas and the ways in which the film kind of functions. For me, it's perfect that they feel like that. I mean, it's, you know, Society is one of those films. It's like how much of Society would not work if it was made today and wasn't made with practical effects. It's like you need that physicality, you need that kind of thing that you can, these people are like touching each other. Imagine like a CGI Society, it'd be an absolute nightmare. But so, you know, I mean, I love the effects. I think they're extraordinary. You know, they're kind of simultaneously look perfect and sometimes look terrible in the same ways. But none of that matters.
Yeah, the butthead moment in particular is perfect. Perfect example of that, isn't it? It's so good. So there you go. I mean, I don't know how much else there is to say on Society, really. I mean, is there anything else that we've missed that you want to mention? Any other highlights or specific moments?
Oh, where do I start? No. I mean, I think, like I said, you know, the joy of Society is its literal quality.
Yeah, it is what it is.
You know, but that's not something to like take away from it. I think that's something that kind of oddly worked against it.
Yes.
In many ways. But I think it's a film that it's remarkable in the way that it still stands up to date, still speaks to like each new kind of generation. I think, you know, the like you said, with kind of Trump, it's impossible not to go there. That film you could pick that, be like, that's just been made and it was a response to what's happening at the moment. Be like, yeah, cool, fair enough.
I know, it's interesting. I wonder if we will get any kind of society-esque, you know, Trump-era horror movie. One that is more like that, like in that kind of grotesque end of the spectrum. It feels like we are, like you said, at the perfect time for another one of these types of movies,
exactly.
Right?
It's like it's legitimately terrifying if you kind of step back and kind of look at the mirror that it holds up.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's extraordinary in the way that it still does that. And I think that it, you know, it absolutely does deserve to be talked about outside of the Shunt.
Yes, the Shunt,
you know,
exactly.
No matter how extraordinary the Shunt is, there's so much kind of going on in that film. There's so much fun to be had. There's so much invention and surrealism and humour. It's absolutely one of my faves.
I love it so much. And finally then, I mean, we've talked about him at the beginning, Brian Usner. I mean, just for anyone out there who maybe has never seen any of his other work, where would you recommend people go from there after Society?
Definitely to Return of the Living Dead 3.
Yeah.
It's really wonderful. You know, it's definitely completely removed from the kind of knockabout zombie comedy romps of Return of the Living Dead and the kind of less successful sequel.
Yeah.
This goes much more into the kind of terrains of melodrama. Like it's a kind of Romeo and Juliet-esque love story with, you know, the undead. It's really good. It's a really beautiful film.
I only watched it for the first time in the last year, actually, and it was not at all what I was expecting, having just watched 1 and 2. But
I'd say with Usner, anything up to and including The Dentist is wonderful. You'll have a good time with whatever you watch, and you can see glimpses of what should have been, and even in the slightly less successful ones in those kind of early period, you can see that, you know, this was someone that could have been amazing.
Or
was amazing, don't get me wrong.
Was amazing.
But was never quite embraced in the way that I wish they would have been.
Have you ever gotten to screen Society on the big screen at the BFI?
Yeah, at BFI. I've actually done Society and I've done Return of the Living Dead 3.
Amazing.
I'm so predictable with my choices.
I love it. That's great. I bet Society would look good on a big screen, though.
Yeah, it was. I mean, quite often, like I've said to you before, like I put on films because they're the films that I want to watch on the big screen. So it's like, I just want to sit in NFT one and watch Society.
Yeah, like 13-year-old you would just look at the you of now and be like, this is the coolest thing ever that you're getting to do this. That's amazing. Well, thank you so much, Michael, once again for this. It's been so much fun. And just tell us one more time, where can people find everything that you've got going on at the BFI at the moment?
Sure. So at the moment it's really focused on London Film Festival. BFI is open again now, but we're kind of holding off on TerraVision screenings for a little bit. So kind of watch this space in terms of that. But London Film Festival runs from the 7th to the 18th of October. Check it out. Check out the whole thing, but particularly the cult strand for 3 horror gems.
Love it. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my wonderful 2 guests, Michael Blyth and Lou Thomas. So, what did you think of this week's episode? What do you think of this week's films? I would love to hear some of your thoughts and interpretations on Tetsuo and Society. Please do get in touch. You can email us at evolutionofhorror@gmail.com, and don't forget, you can also find us on all social media and come and chat to us there: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And if you want to discuss this week's films with fellow listeners, you can. Just sign up to the Evolution of Horror discussion group. That can be found on Facebook. If you want to support this podcast and be treated to weekly bonus content, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolutionofhorror. If you donate $5 per month, you will be treated to bonus content every other week. That can be a review of a new release, it can be festival coverage, it could be a review of an old classic, it could be a mailbag episode. We've got some exciting things coming up for Halloween. We are, of course, going to be covering The Haunting of Hill House, and maybe also bringing you a little bonus Halloween treat as well. And if you're able to donate $10 per month, you will get all of that I just mentioned, as well as access to our exclusive mini-seasons, including a mini-series on extreme cinema and a mini-series on Twin Peaks. So if you sign up to the $10 tier, you will get bonus episodes every single week. One more time, that's patreon.com/evolution of horror. You can find this podcast on all major podcast platforms. Please subscribe to us. Please do tell your friends and family about us. And if you get a spare minute, we would hugely appreciate an Apple Podcast rating or review. It really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, next time then, we're up to part 16. I can't believe we're already so far in. Next week, we're swinging back to Horror of the Mind and two of the most baffling and frightening and disturbing and nightmarish psychological horrors I have ever seen. Next week, I'm going to be joined by Ghibliotech's very own Michael Leader, and we are going to be discussing Jacob's Ladder from 1990 and David Lynch's Lost Highway from 1997. Ooh, you might want to drink for that double bill. Join us next week for all of this and more on the evolution of horror.